More than a dozen armored vehicles, supply trucks, and multiple Russian infantry groups were reported put out of action during a brief period of fighting near Pokrovsk, according to Ukrainian sources. The engagements occurred in an area where FPV drones and reconnaissance UAVs maintained persistent aerial presence. While precise loss figures are still under review, available reporting indicates that a mechanized advance involving tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and additional counter-drone measures did not progress beyond its initial phase. The advance appears to have stalled not due to a single strike, but because movement across the area was consistently detected, tracked, and engaged from the air. Vehicles were reportedly struck before reaching direct contact with opposing forces. Infantry units were engaged while advancing, repositioning, or transporting supplies. Routes intended for logistic support instead became areas of exposure. Under these conditions, slowing movement increased vulnerability, and stopping often resulted in engagement. Analysts following the conflict note that this episode reflects a broader shift in battlefield dynamics. Rather than relying on isolated drone strikes, Ukrainian forces appear to be integrating aerial surveillance with FPV strike capabilities to influence timing, movement, and distance. This approach allows drone units to shape engagements by determining when and where ground forces can operate, effectively turning low-altitude airspace into a continuous observation and engagement layer. What unfolded near Pokrovsk suggests the growing difficulty of conducting traditional assaults in environments where roads, tree lines, and damaged structures are under constant aerial observation, and where precision strikes can be delivered faster than ground units can adapt, according to available footage in Ukrainian reporting. The sequence began with Russian infantry advancing in small groups in the Novopavlivka sector. Uneven spacing and disrupted formations developed as soldiers moved across open ground and damaged terrain. In one instance, a soldier moved farther from cover than intended while attempting to adjust direction. That movement was detected by a Ukrainian reconnaissance UAV already operating overhead. Rather than immediately striking, the UAV maintained altitude and visual contact, keeping the individual under observation. Shortly afterward, an FPV drone was launched toward the tracked position. Flying at low altitude and high speed, it closed the distance as the soldier attempted to find cover among trees and debris that no longer provided concealment from aerial surveillance. The engagement concluded before the individual could regroup or coordinate with nearby troops, who were already dispersed and moving independently. In the same area, other infantry elements attempted short relocations between damaged buildings and tree lines. Each movement was monitored by UAVs maintaining continuous visual tracking. Some soldiers slowed or paused, while others attempted to move quickly toward cover. Reporting suggests that once a UAV maintained contact, these choices had limited effect on the outcome. FPV drones were directed toward the tracked positions, often arriving before nearby units could react or fully assess the situation. As individual targets were engaged, additional movement in the vicinity became visible from above. Attempts to evade by changing direction or running often exposed further positions. FPV drones were then redirected toward newly detected movement, resulting in successive engagements. Throughout this phase, fighting remained focused on individual soldiers and small groups, rather than large formations, with encounters unfolding rapidly once detection occurred. These engagements took place along approaches leading toward Pokrovsk, an area considered strategically sensitive due to its role in supply routes and access toward the Dnipropetrovsk region. Analysts note that this context helps explain why drone units remained active even against isolated infantry, as preventing small elements from establishing positions can disrupt broader operational plans. Attempts to shelter temporarily inside damaged structures were also limited in effectiveness. Entry and exit points were monitored, and movement was detected when personnel attempted to relocate. Multiple engagements followed a similar sequence: detection, sustained tracking, and a strike delivered before nearby units could respond or establish coordination. By this stage, the ground situation became increasingly fragmented. Russian infantry were no longer operating as cohesive units, but as dispersed individuals reacting to ongoing aerial pressure. No clearly defined front line was evident. Instead, the situation consisted of repeated short engagements that gradually reduced manpower and disrupted coordination before heavier forces could be brought forward. Observers note that the outcome of this phase was not defined by territory gained or lost, but by the absence of organized movement. Infantry presence diminished, and coordination broke down early in the engagement cycle. What began with the detection of a single individual developed into a broader effort to deny movement, where any visible motion became a trigger for engagement, and the tempo of operations was set primarily by aerial systems rather than ground maneuver. The second phase begins as Russian forces shift from dispersed infantry movement to a more concentrated mechanized advance near Pokrovsk, with tanks and armored vehicles moving together along defined routes toward Ukrainian positions. Infantry fighting vehicles follow closely behind heavier armor, with engines kept running as crews attempt to cross exposed ground before full contact develops. According to information cited by Reuters, Ukrainian sources describe this as an unusually large mechanized effort in the Pokrovsk area, involving approximately 30 vehicles, rather than the smaller probing actions observed earlier. As the column advances, Ukrainian reconnaissance drones are already overhead, maintaining position and tracking the direction of movement as the vehicles pass through open road sections and damaged urban edges. FPV drones begin to appear shortly afterward, flying at low altitude and approaching from multiple directions, while the column continues forward without breaking formation. Initial strikes occur near the front of the column, hitting lead vehicles and forcing crews to react under immediate pressure. One vehicle slows after being struck, requiring those behind it to adjust speed and spacing as dust and debris spread along the route. Several infantry carriers move slightly off the road in search of partial cover, while others change direction to avoid collision. As a result, the original alignment of the column begins to loosen. FPV drones continue to arrive in quick succession, focusing on vehicles that slow down or fall out of sync with the rest of the group. As the advance stretches out, short gaps form between vehicles, and these separations draw additional attention from drones overhead. Infantry inside the carriers face limited options, remaining mounted in vehicles under threat or preparing to dismount into areas already under aerial observation. Additional FPV drones strike from the sides and rear, targeting vehicles that have drifted away from the main body or slowed to navigate obstacles. Tanks that were expected to lead the advance are forced to reduce speed as well, as moving ahead without support increases exposure, while accompanying vehicles struggle to keep pace. The route becomes increasingly congested with damaged equipment, smoke, and debris, narrowing movement options and limiting the ability to maneuver or turn around. Drivers focus on navigating blocked sections of road, while crews attempt to scan for threats that cannot be directly observed from inside armored vehicles. FPV drones exploit these moments, adjusting flight paths to follow vehicles that attempt to change direction or pull into partial cover. Several carriers come to a halt after taking damage, and nearby vehicles slow further as crews attempt to avoid disabled equipment. By this stage, the mechanized force no longer advances as a single coordinated unit, but as separate elements reacting to immediate threats from above. Communication becomes more difficult as vehicles read unevenly along the route, and no clear path forward remains. Ukrainian drones maintain pressure throughout, striking vehicles that hesitate or stop, then shifting quickly to the next visible target. Each new strike adds to congestion along the approach, turning the planned advance into a confined corridor filled with obstacles and limited exits. In some areas, infantry dismount and seek shelter near vehicles or nearby structures, while drones continue to monitor these movements closely. The push gradually loses forward momentum as more vehicles are damaged or blocked by those already disabled ahead. Attempts to regroup are constrained by continuous drone surveillance, which tracks renewed movement along the same routes. The advance ultimately ends with vehicles scattered along the approach, some damaged and others stationary, with crews focused on survival rather than continued progress. The third phase highlights how Ukrainian forces operate their drone kill chain during fighting near Pokrovsk. According to available reporting and footage, reconnaissance UAVs and FPV drones operate as part of a coordinated sequence rather than as isolated systems. The process begins with reconnaissance drones, maintaining steady positions above the area, observing damaged vehicles, halted columns, and nearby infantry without immediately initiating strikes. These UAVs operate at altitudes that reduce exposure to ground fire while maintaining continuous visual contact, adjusting positio, and to keep targets within view as movement continues below. Once a vehicle or group of soldiers is confirmed, coordinates are fixed and passed on, and the reconnaissance drone remains on station to track changes on the ground. FPV drones are then launched sequentially rather than as a single wave, with each drone guided toward a specific target already identified from above. As the first FPV drone approaches, the reconnaissance UAV continues to observe, allowing adjustments if a vehicle changes direction or if infantry move away from the original position. After the strike, the UAV immediately assesses the result and scans for remaining movement around the impact site. If a vehicle is damaged but still mobile, another FPV drone is dispatched, often approaching from a different angle while visual contact is maintained. Infantry who dismount after a strike are also tracked as their movement becomes visible once they leave vehicles or attempt to regroup nearby. This sequence is repeated across multiple targets, creating a steady operational rhythm rather than isolated engagements. Ukrainian drone crews reportedly sustain this process by rotating FPV drones while keeping reconnaissance platforms overhead whenever possible. As a result, Russian vehicles and infantry are not confronted by a single unexpected strike, but remain under observation while follow-up attacks are prepared. With FPV drones arriving in sequence, crews on the ground face repeated pressure with limited time to change position between impacts. Vehicles that attempt to move after an initial strike are tracked again, and infantry relocating between cover points remain visible during each movement. Smoke, dust, and debris from earlier strikes do not halt the process, as reconnaissance drones adjust altitude and viewing angles to maintain visibility. As FPV drones continue to arrive, the space around the halted advance becomes increasingly controlled, with movement below reacting to threats that follow a predictable but continuous sequence. Analysts note that this system reduces uncertainty in engagement decisions. Detection occurs first, confirmation follows, and strikes are launched only once targets are fixed. On the ground, this results in a loss of initiative, as vehicles and infantry are forced to respond to drone activity rather than reorganize or continue advancing. Even where personnel numbers remain, the ability to maneuver freely is significantly reduced once the drone kill chain remains active over the same area. By this stage, the engagement depends less on sudden clashes and more on which side controls observation and strike timing. Near Pokrovsk, that control allows Ukrainian forces to determine when and where engagements occur, while the mechanized force below remains under continuous surveillance. As armored vehicles are damaged or immobilized, soldiers dismount and move in small numbers toward nearby houses, temporary shelters, tree lines, and shallow field posi. Shans, in an effort to reduce visibility. Some enter ruined buildings through broken doors or collapsed walls, while others take cover along forest edges or in hastily prepared positions. Ukrainian drones continue to operate over these areas, circling slowly and monitoring movement as infantry attempt to relocate. When a soldier exits a doorway or shifts position inside a damaged structure, the movement is detected and the location remains under observation. FPV drones are then directed toward these points, flying low through rubble-filled streets or along tree lines where infantry attempt to move discreetly. Damage to buildings limits safe movement, with collapsed roofs, blocked stairways, and exposed interiors forcing predictable exit routes that are already visible from above. Structures that once offered protection no longer provide full concealment, as open walls and damaged ceilings allow aerial observation. Along forest edges, similar patterns emerge. Soldiers press deeper into cover, then move toward another patch of trees when they sense drone activity overhead. Each movement creates a brief window of exposure that reconnaissance drones hold long enough for FPV strikes to follow. Some soldiers attempt to remain stationary, while others move quickly, but both choices carry risk under sustained observation. FPV drones approach from above in shallow angles, entering courtyards, moving through gaps between structures and closing distance before infantry can relocate. Again, after each strike, nearby movement often increases as soldiers attempt to flee or change direction, revealing additional positions to drones already overhead. The ground situation becomes increasingly fragmented, with no clearly defined front line and no stable area where forces can pause long enough to restore coordination. Observers note that once infantry lose the protection of vehicles, pressure builds rapidly because every decision is made under continuous surveillance. Some groups manage short withdrawals, though these movements are often tracked until they reach the edge of drone coverage or move into deeper terrain. Others abandon planned routes when FPV drones appear, pushing them into unfamiliar areas with thinner cover and fewer escape options. As the fighting continues, the number of active infantry in the area declines, not through a single decisive clash, but through repeated engagements that gradually reduce presence over time. By this stage, the engagement is no longer defined by holding terrain, but by the ability to remain intact, long enough to exit areas under constant aerial observation. The pressure does not come from a single assault, but from sustained tracking that follows infantry through nearly every form of shelter they attempt to use. The result is a battlefield where concealment is limited, movement carries increasing risk, and even brief exposure can lead to immediate engagement under the low-altitude airspace around Pokrovsk. The fifth H-phase illustrates how drone pressure shifts from disabling vehicles to undermining the ability of Russian forces to reorganize as FPV attacks continue along supply lines and withdrawal routes near the area. After the mechanized advance breaks down, small infantry groups attempt to restore order by moving ammunition forward, escorting wounded personnel, or crossing exposed gaps to reconnect with other elements. These activities take place along narrow paths, damaged streets, and open spaces between structures. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones, according to reporting and available footage, monitor these routes closely once movement is detected. When soldiers carry ammunition by hand or move in small groups toward fallback positions, the activity is identified quickly, and FPV drones are launched toward those locations before transfers can be completed. Several engagements reportedly unfold in this manner, with FPV strikes hitting personnel who are not advancing toward Ukrainian positions but attempting to sustain or extract their units. As analysts note, the loss of a small number of runners or carriers can interrupt ammunition flow, forcing remaining soldiers to halt and seek cover. This, in turn, limits the ability to regroup or restore coordination. Pressure continues as withdrawing troops attempt to cross short open stretches between shelters. Drones follow closely, closing distance before groups can reach the next piece of cover. Unmanned ground vehicles used to transport ammunition are also tracked along predictable routes. Once detected, FPV drones strike the cargo, in some cases triggering secondary explosions that render those routes unusable. Artillery positions are affected in a similar way. Reconnaissance drones scan for signs such as disturbed ground, entry points to dugouts, or heat traces that indicate concealed guns. FPV drones are then directed into these shelters, reaching artillery systems that may no longer be firing but remain essential for support and defense. Each such strike reduces the ability to provide covering fire or resupply nearby infantry, leaving remaining troops without expected support. Soft-skin vehicles become particularly vulnerable during this phase. Trucks and civilian vehicles adapted for military use attempt to move fuel, food, and ammunition forward along roads already under drone observation. Several are struck while still in motion before reaching unloading points or protected areas. Some drivers attempt to stop near trees or damaged buildings, but the movement itself draws attention, and FPV drones arrive before cargo can be dispersed. The impact of these losses is not always immediately visible. Fuel deliveries fail to arrive, ammunition stocks decline, and relief units are delayed. Rather than a single decisive explosion, the effect accumulates over time, gradually emptying positions and forcing remaining soldiers to conserve resources. As supply routes break down, coordination weakens leaving small groups isolated without clear orders or the means to continue sustained fighting. By this point, the battlefield is defined increasingly by absence rather than presence, as fewer movements are observed and fewer attempts are made to re-enter contested areas. Ukrainian drones continue to patrol the same zones, engaging any renewed effort to move personnel or equipment forward. Observers note that this level of control is reinforced by sustained drone availability, supported by plans to acquire large numbers of FPV systems, allowing pressure to remain continuous rather than episodic. If Pokrovsk is viewed as a gateway in this phase of the campaign, the fighting around it delivers a clear message. Reporting from the area shows how quickly a traditional mechanized push can lose effectiveness once low-altitude airspace is controlled and movement is consistently monitored. Armored columns initially conveyed strength, but that advantage diminished as drones dictated speed, direction, and timing. Step by step, the engagement shifted away from direct clashes and toward control of movement, with UAVs and FPV drones determining who could advance, reposition, or withdraw. Analysts emphasize that this outcome was not the result of a single strike, but of a sustained process that gradually removed options until the advance could no longer continue. The broader question moving forward is how Russian forces respond to this pressure. Measures such as electronic warfare, weather conditions, and wider dispersion may reduce effectiveness in some cases, but it remains unclear whether they can disrupt the cycle entirely. At the same time, Ukraine faces its own challenge, whether production capacity, training pipelines, and coordination can sustain this level of drone activity and make engagements like those near Pokrovsk a repeatable pattern rather than an isolated episode.